the background to this project is that my grandson became very keen in having a model railway, he thought, but having heard Keith's presentations, it's basically a train set. And this was one to fit in under his bed. And going to the Friday groups, I could discuss with the guys what's the best way to go, what gauge to use, N gauge, OO gauge, DC, DCC. So it was very useful to talk to everyone and see what their points of view were. So ended up with OO, because he was only 6 years, well, 5-year-old at that time, and trying to keep it as simple as possible, end up with OO gauge and DC for powering it. Now, once you get the train set in situ and he was putting buildings on, that of course COVID came in and could no longer visit him because he stays through in Falkirk. I was looking for a project to add on to his train set, and in the February when we'd been at the last exhibition at Glasgow, he saw some scrapyards in some of the layouts, so this is what he wanted on his. So what I decided to do was to put a scrapyard in this corner of his layout and try and produce some animation into it. So one of the ideas I had was to create a mechanical scrap crusher that you see for crushing cars and such like, animate the scene, add lights and control it electronically. So they're all ideal things to find out about at the MERG meetings. Ideas for the crusher really just came from trawling the internet and looking at the photographs. And the one on the right hand side is actually a model that someone actually made already. And the one on the left is from a brochure of a company who manufactures them. And just with a combination of different things, my initial ideas were to have a moving crane with working rams and the grab. The crusher doors would open, they would close, and then you'd be able to eject a bale out the end. All very ambitious. But you know, with all projects, you've got to try and put some common sense into it, otherwise you'll never finish them. On the mechanical design, although I do PCB design, still do PCB design, I've actually got a cadence license that I just paid over £800 there for renewing for another year. I wasn't going to start installing something like SolidWorks. I have used Onshape a few years ago because I do model engineering, and I designed an engine for a K2 lorry using it, but it was very laborious. And when you're not used to using a design system, you spend more time trying to learn the system than produce the goods. And that's why I decided on using one called Tinkercad. It's very, very basic. It's like the small building blocks a toddler would have to build something. It just works on squares, triangles, circles, spheres, etc. It's web-based, it's free, and it's suitable for quite simple designs. And more to the point, for me, it's easy to go back to. If you don't use it for a few months, go back to it, you pick it up quite quickly. And also exports files for 3D printing quite easily. These are just some screenshots of the parts that I designed for the small crusher, and that's just all made up with the Tinkercad. You can see there on the left-hand side, I've got the holes for the servo to fix on, and the two holes at the back are for the doors, same as the two at the front there. And the one down the bottom, that was something I never actually got round to, and that was putting another servo on to push out the square bale once it was produced. And down the bottom right, that's just shows you the cab, the way it was made up. The geometry for the jib, that's something which I possibly would have another look at because it didn't work out 100%. 3D printing, I don't have a 3D printer yet, although there's one coming to me. I had a birthday there, so the kids all got together and they bought me a Prusa 3D printer, so that's another learning curve. But for this one, a friend of mine's got one and he printed all the parts, and there you'll see some of the parts down the bottom there, and it partially assembled. The gears I got through Amazon. You can buy a whole pack of gears there like that for a few pounds. The spindles, I already had some 2mm plastic rods, so I used that. But I found it was too flimsy for the cab, so I ended up having to turn down a small brass part to put in there to support the cab. And I didn't glue the gears in place. All I did was put just a small 0.9mm drill through, and that lets you use the small black pins you use to hold down the rails. So this shows the assembled crusher. It shows you that the cab with I made a roof for it. It was 3D printed as well, and the jib, and all the red parts are 3D printed. The gears, as discussed there, just out from off the Amazon, and connecting to the servo to the electronics. So it's connecting the servo to the doors that open and close, and a wee bit disaster to begin with because I had a pin straight through them. But when I powered up the servo, it went bananas and just kept rotating and sheared right through the spindle. So I actually used a servo I got with my Arduino kit, and it seemed to work better. And all I did was make it look just a slot at one end and a pin in the shaft just to locate it in, and that made it easier to try and align everything before I powered it up. It's controlled by the Merg Easy Points pocket money kit, and that was one of the things we discussed down at the meetings was which way should you go? Should you go Arduino or should you go the money kits? But I felt for simplicity and easier to say repair, and my lack of knowledge with Arduino was to go down the money kits, pocket money kits, and the light and sound were added and had a sequencer to switch them all on, and it really was all done with the help of the Merg group and the meetings we have and these Zoom calls. Really, I learned a lot of stuff here. So this is the animated half of the scrapyard. There you see this crusher at the back there. In the old wagon here, there's another servo, and the little man there has a paper clip glued to his back so he can come in and out, and the door's just attached with a small piece of cord, which you see goes back in, the cord pulls it shut. And inside I've got the welder kit as well, so it flashes. And then I've mounted some of the small, tiny lights and on top of the cab. So that's the full scene there with that bit you just saw at the back there. In the front's just a static scene, and that's just made out of an Airfix kit with bits of scrap metal put on there. And a great source of the scrap metal that looks like beams is well, being brought up in the 50s and 60s, you don't waste anything. And if you walk around the streets, you'll see a lot of small metal parts that I think come off these street sweeping machines. As they rotate round, they tend to break off. And you'll see some which are pristine condition and others are rusted, and they're just perfect for something like this. So my wife hates me walking around the street like this, picking them up, but I let them go to waste. And that's the top left. You'll see the controller that I built for it with all the kits inside it, and it's pluggable. Everything is plugged into there, so I can, when COVID restrictions were lifted in the middle of the year, I took it through to Falkirk and could install it into his kit, into his layout quite quickly. This is a control box I made up. Top left, 12 volts comes in from an external power supply. It's not the 12 volts it's used for powering the train. It's just a separate transformer for that. And we've got the sequencer, which is again the pocket money kit on the left-hand side. The welder and the buzzer, I combined them into one small board rather than having another two long boards. And then there's a servo, easy points for one servo, and same for the other one. I also put a small DC to DC converter to take out 5 volts, so I could take these to any LEDs I wanted to add externally. There's also, see there, if you can see on the right, I've got the connections that go to the different parts, a small red button to test it, and the trigger, which would go to remote trigger on his train set to allow him to press a button and the whole thing would be activated. So this is a video of it working, hopefully. So there you can see the welder working, the crane swings round, the man goes back into the hut, goes back out again. And then, of course, added a small sound module as well, I forgot to mention that. It's just a steam one, but it's just to give some sound to it. Now after the MP3 player, you could probably make it a lot more complicated than that. So this is where it's installed into his train set. It's up in the top left-hand corner. And the start button is a small control box I made from here. So he's got to control both inside and outside. And down the right there, you'll see all the buttons. Now, most of these are not used at the moment. Some switch on the LEDs and one activates the crusher. I was back through last week, maybe it was to do child minding, and it's still working. So since I made the crusher, I also made the small platform display board, and we put that on, so that works away fine. And you can see, and this was actually featured in the Metcalf website because he's got a lot of Metcalf kits, and it shows his train. It actually fits right underneath his bed, so he can push it away, and his mother can hoover about, and they can pull it back out and play with it. The buildings he produces here it's back to what Keith was saying before about having it modular. All these buildings are fitted onto very thin plywood, so it can actually just create a scene, put it down. If it doesn't like it, it can lift it and replace it with something else. So this is him here making all his different scenes, and he's getting a great lot of pleasure out of it. And hopefully that will continue until he gets his Xbox. And once they get an Xbox, that's will disappear into the room forever. So that's really been my progress in developing this project. And just a thanks to to David and Chick and these people for all their advice and bearing with me and maybe some of the stupid questions I asked. So thank you.